On Hitler's map, Leningrad no longer existed. He had drawn a red line around the city and written one simple instruction beside it. Let it die. No assault, no surrender, just silence by starvation. In September 1941, the German Army Group North closed the ring. The last railway was cut at Mga. The roads to the south fell days later. 2.5 million people, soldiers, workers, children, were trapped inside the walls of their own city. The siege began without ceremony. One morning the tram stopped. That evening, the bread ration dropped. By the next week, people understood no help was coming. Hitler told his generals, do not take prisoners. Leningrad must vanish from the earth. The order reached even the artillery batteries facing the city. They adjusted their sights and waited. Inside Leningrad, the weather turned early. Cold crept into the bones of the buildings. The Neva River darkened, its surface carrying dead leaves and empty barrels. The factories stood silent, their chimneys pointed like fingers to a sky that no longer cared. In a diary found years later, a 12-year-old girl wrote, "Today Uncle Lyova died. Yesterday Mama. I am alone now. The windows are frozen. I cannot see the street." Her handwriting shook but stayed neat, as if the act of writing itself still obeyed a kind of order. At first, the city tried to pretend it was still alive. Public loudspeakers played music, quiet marches, broken by static. A woman in a heavy coat stood before the Philharmonic building, selling tickets no one could afford to use. Tram conductors reported for duty, though there were no trams. A man was seen painting, "We shall not surrender," on a wall already cracked by shellfire. And then the shells began. German batteries opened up from the south, the first salvos landing near the Baltic station. Windows shattered, streets filled with dust. When the smoke lifted, people simply swept glass from their steps and waited for the next one. The smell of brick dust became the smell of the city itself. The ration cards came on gray paper. Workers received 400 grams of bread a day. Dependents, half that. Children, less still. By October, the flour ran short. Bread was mixed with sawdust, wallpaper paste, ground cellulose. It looked like food, but it wasn't. People chewed slowly to make it last longer. Water froze in the pipes. Electricity failed. Hospitals went dark except for the small blue glow of gas lamps. Families carried buckets to the river, broke the ice with axes, and drew water mixed with ash and blood. At night, the cold deepened. Apartments became tombs. People burned furniture, books, parquet flooring. A neighbor was seen carrying a piano leg home in triumph, as if it were treasure. In December, the temperature dropped below -30. Dead horses were stripped on the streets. Dogs disappeared. A note posted on a lamppost read, "If you see our dog, please don't eat it. The children are crying." Yet the city did not surrender. The factories, those that could, resumed work. Workers wrapped their hands in rags to handle frozen metal. Shells rolled from the lines, their casings warm against the skin. Somewhere in the smog, an old tram began moving again, pulled by hand along the rails to deliver munitions. Artillery fire answered artillery fire. The defenders used the frozen river as their line. In one corner of the city, a teacher gathered her students in an unheated classroom. She told them, "You will write every day? Someday, someone will read it and know we were here." They wrote on scraps of paper, sometimes with charcoal when pencils ran out. Their essays were about hunger, about snow, about dreams of spring. Outside, the snow grew taller than the dead. Carts moved through the streets at dawn, collecting bodies left at doorways. People no longer turned their heads. They saved their energy for breathing. The Germans watched from the opposite bank through binoculars. One officer wrote in his report, "The city is finished. Resistance will collapse in 2 weeks." But 2 weeks passed, then 2 months, then 200 days, and the city still lived. In a photograph from the archives, taken that winter, you can see a soldier and a small girl standing on a frozen street. Behind them, a tram line stretches into white emptiness. The girl's hand rests on the soldier's coat. He's looking away. She's looking at the camera. No one remembers their names. But their faces say what every report failed to understand: that some cities do not die the way maps expect them to. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. When the temperature dropped below -30, the bread was no longer bread. It was a dark brick of sawdust and cellulose, baked into something you could chew only because the body refused to stop trying. And yet, people still queued for it. Miles of thin shadows standing in silence for their 125 grams. The line would begin before dawn and end only when there was nothing left to sell. The winter of 1941 to 42 became the city's true enemy. The siege had already taken away light, warmth, and hope. The cold came to finish what hunger had started. Pipes froze. Doors stuck to their frames. Every breath was a small cloud that hung in the air like memory. Electricity had vanished weeks earlier. The trams were dead, frozen in place, their windows frosted white from the inside. People slept on the platforms because the wind was weaker there. Even the clocks in the station stopped, hands fixed on meaningless hours. Inside the apartments, life shrank to the radius of a candle. Families gathered around small flames, counting the minutes of light before the wick burned out. They burned everything that would burn: furniture, wallpaper, the wooden railings of staircases. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of starvation. A teacher wrote in her notebook, "We wrote with pencil until it broke. Then we wrote with coal. When the coal was gone, we scratched words into paper with nails." Her handwriting trembled but did not stop. She believed that words, like breath, might keep the city alive a little longer. By January, 4 to 5,000 people were dying every day. The morgues overflowed. The streets filled with sledges carrying bodies wrapped in sheets. There were no funerals. People simply found a quiet corner of snow and left their dead to the frost. One child's diary recorded it with terrible calm. "Grandmother sleeps outside now. We cannot lift her." In the kitchens, water froze in buckets. The last potatoes turned to stone. People boiled wallpaper for the glue, scraped the leather from belts, chewed candle wax. There were whispers about worse things, things no one wanted to write down. Still, the city worked. The Kirov factory, roof blown open by shellfire, produced shells and tank parts under blankets of snow. Workers wore layers of rags over their hands, swinging hammers that stuck to the metal when they missed. "We are fighting the cold with iron," one of them said, and no one laughed because it was true. Artillery from the German lines fired day and night. The shells whined over rooftops, landing among houses already half ruined. Every explosion sent flocks of frozen glass into the air. Yet the defenders answered back with guns that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, firing blind through fog and smoke. At night, the sound of bombing mixed with the creak of the river ice. The Neva groaned like an animal in pain. The city seemed to breathe through that sound, slow, heavy, endless. The radio, when it worked, broadcast fragments of news, broken by static. "We are still here. The enemy will not pass. Leningrad fights." People leaned close, hands over the speaker as if it could warm them. The announcer's voice cracked but did not falter. In a basement shelter, an old man read poetry aloud to children. His voice was almost gone from hunger. He recited Pushkin by heart, his breath visible in the cold. One of the children, later grown, remembered that moment. "It was the first time I realized words could burn brighter than fire." By February, even the Germans began to wonder how the city was still standing. Their reconnaissance planes photographed the frozen ruins and sent back reports. "The city appears silent. Resistance has ceased." But on the ground, the silence was deceptive. It was the sound of people refusing to vanish. Somewhere in the center, an orchestra tuned their instruments for the first time in months. They were half-starved, wrapped in blankets, fingers cracked and bleeding. They gathered not for an audience, but for survival. Music, they said, reminded them what being human felt like. The first notes of Shostakovich's unfinished Seventh Symphony rose in that frozen air, thin but defiant. Outside, a snowstorm raged, burying the city again. Soldiers stood guard over bread warehouses, rifles slung low, faces hidden by frost. Every snowdrift hid both the living and the dead. But when morning came, the same streets filled again with people carrying buckets, sledges, small pieces of wood. They were still moving, and that alone was victory. One woman wrote in her journal, "If you walk slowly, the hunger doesn't hurt so much. I walk all day." By spring, nearly 500,000 were gone. But the city had not given up its dead dream of survival. It had only grown quieter, harder, more certain. And just when it seemed life had disappeared completely, When even the birds were gone, something new appeared on the frozen horizon, a thin, dark line across the white expanse of Lake Ladoga. A road, the first connection between the living city and the world beyond the siege. They called it the Road of Life. But everyone who drove it knew the truth. It was a road of death. A white, cracking path across frozen water, where every sound could mean the end. In the winter of 1942, Lake Ladoga froze solid enough to bear trucks. The engineers tested the thickness of the ice with long poles, measuring in silence. At the far end, the city waited. Empty streets, hollow windows, and the faint hope that something might come back across the ice. The first convoy went out on a moonless night. 8 trucks, each loaded with sacks of flour, fuel drums, and the thin promise of survival. Their headlights were covered with blue cloth. The drivers followed the faint shadows of the men ahead. The ice cracked beneath their tires with the sound of slow thunder. No one spoke. They all knew that if one truck stopped, the rest would have to drive past it. The drivers were mostly teenagers, women, and old mechanics. Anyone who could keep a wheel straight and an engine alive. Their hands bled from cold on the steering wheels. The trucks moved at 12 kilometers an hour, far enough apart that if one went down, the others would not follow. The Germans knew about the ice road. Their bombers waited for the sound of engines. When the planes came, the trucks stopped dead, engines off, men pressing their faces to the frozen floor. Bombs shattered the silence, sending waves under the ice. The water below groaned, rippled, froze again. Sometimes the ice didn't return. A driver named Mikhail wrote in his notebook, "The ice cracked under the rear wheels. I saw the water. It was black and breathing. I kept driving because behind me was Leningrad, and Leningrad was not allowed to die." Every kilometer was a prayer. The air smelled of gasoline, frost, and smoke. The sound of metal chains on tires became the heartbeat of the city. By morning, the first convoy reached the shore. The sacks of flour were pulled off by soldiers who could barely lift them. One of them kissed the side of a truck and whispered, "You made it." For every truck that reached Leningrad, another never came back. Some vanished into cracks that opened without warning. Others were hit by bombs, swallowed by the lake before the fire had time to fade. When spring came, fishermen would find their roofs and wheels trapped in the thawed ice, silent memorials to men who had tried to feed the living. But the road kept going. Night after night, convoys crawled over the frozen water. The drivers learned to read the sounds of the ice. A low moan meant it would hold. A high crack meant run. They taped small icons to the dashboards, carried letters in their coats, and never took off their gloves even to eat. Each trip took 7 hours one way. They drove with frost on their eyelashes, staring into darkness that seemed alive. Once, a truck stopped in the middle of the lake. The driver climbed out and began pushing, his boots sliding. Another driver saw him fall through the ice, arms flailing. He did not scream. The second truck drove on. In the city, the arrival of each convoy was greeted like a sunrise. People gathered at the depots, holding buckets, pans, anything that could carry food. The smell of bread returned to some streets, faint, impossible, holy. Children pressed their faces to windows just to breathe it in. And then came the reverse journey. The same trucks, lighter now, carrying the city's children out. They sat in the backs of open vehicles wrapped in blankets, eyes wide and empty. Some had never seen a road before, only hunger. A woman nurse recalled, "They did not cry. They looked at us as if afraid to believe we were real." The ice groaned under their weight, as if the lake itself wanted to keep them. Bombs fell again, but the convoys drove on. When the trucks finally reached the far shore, the nurses lifted the children out one by one. Some stood on their own. Others did not. By the end of that winter, more than 500,000 people had escaped the siege through that frozen road. Thousands of tons of food had crossed the same fragile bridge of ice. The death toll was unspeakable, but the city still breathed. The German command called it madness, to drive trucks across a lake under fire, night after night. But madness has its own logic. For Leningrad, the road across the ice was not just transport, it was defiance made visible. A thread between life and extinction, stretched thin but unbroken. When the thaw finally came, the ice cracked for good. The road sank back into the lake, taking its ghosts with it. But by then, the city had survived another winter. In a soldier's diary, found later among the ruins, There is one last line written in shaking pencil. The lake is open now. The road is gone. But we remember where it was. And that memory, that invisible road of courage and loss, would keep the city alive for another year. Even when the streets were lined with bodies, the factories never stopped. Even when there was no light, the whistles still sounded at dawn. By 1942, Leningrad was no longer merely surviving. It was fighting. The city had turned itself into a fortress of machines, its hunger hammered into weapons. Every factory floor was a front line. Every worker was a soldier without a rifle. The great defense plants, Kirov, Izora, Obukhov, still breathed, even when half their roofs had been blown open by shellfire. Women, children, and the elderly worked at the lathes with fingers wrapped in rags. They wore 3 coats, 2 pairs of socks, and no gloves, because gloves caught in the gears. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and frozen sweat. A woman named Vera, an assembly worker, wrote in her notebook, "We had no meat, no bread. But we had steel, and it was enough." Her husband had died at the front. She still came to the plant every morning, walking 3 kilometers through the snow, carrying her tools in a small cloth bag. Each gram of metal was counted. Scrap from destroyed buildings, twisted beams, and even iron bed frames were melted down to make shells and bullets. The furnaces burned day and night, their orange light glowing through shattered windows, painting the snow red. When the air raids came, the workers didn't stop. They crouched beside their machines until the dust settled, then went back to work. The rhythm of the hammers drowned the sound of the sirens. The city was teaching itself to ignore death. Artillerymen on the front lines received shells marked, "Made in Leningrad." They handled them with something close to reverence. One soldier later recalled, "We fired their hunger at the enemy." And still, there was music. Even in the ruins, there was music. In the summer of 1942, while bombs fell and famine tore the city apart, preparations began for a concert, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The composer had written it during the first months of the siege before being evacuated. Now, the city decided it must be heard here, inside the ring of fire. Musicians were gathered from wherever they could be found, soldiers, survivors, hospital patients. Some had not touched their instruments in months. Their uniforms hung loose on their bodies. Rehearsals took place in an unheated hall, the windows covered with sandbags. Musicians fainted during practice, revived with a spoon of sugar or a sip of hot water, and kept playing. On August 9, 1942, the performance began. The Philharmonic Hall was packed with soldiers, workers, nurses, everyone who could still walk. Outside, artillery batteries opened fire, not at the city, but over it, a coordinated barrage to silence German guns long enough for the concert to be heard. When the orchestra began the slow, marching theme, the sound rolled across the city, across the front lines, and into the enemy trenches. German soldiers later said they heard it echoing over the battlefield. One wrote in his diary, "We thought the city was dead." Then it played music. In that moment, Leningrad was no longer a ruin. It was alive, defiant, human, furious. The symphony was more than music, it was a declaration. You will not erase us. When the concert ended, there was no applause, just silence, thick and heavy. Some people wept quietly. Others simply sat still, because standing was too much. The musicians put down their instruments one by one, too weak to bow. But the world outside the city was already listening. Radio stations in London, New York, and Moscow rebroadcast the performance. Across oceans and continents, people heard the sound of survival and called it a miracle. In the following months, the work continued. Schools reopened, not because there were lessons to teach, but because there were children left to remind that the city still had a future. Theaters held readings by candlelight. Librarians risked their lives to save books from burning buildings. A doctor in a hospital near the front kept a piano beside the operating table. Between surgeries, he played Chopin with blood still on his hands. The German High Command dismissed it all as propaganda. Their intelligence reports claimed Soviet radio attempts to conceal the death of the city. But every explosion from Leningrad's guns said otherwise. The siege dragged into another year. Food remained scarce, the cold relentless. But now, when people queued for bread, they hummed pieces of the Seventh Symphony. When the air raids began, they waited for the all-clear and went back to their machines. The city was no longer just enduring, it was preparing. It waited for the moment when it could finally answer back with fire. January 13th, 1943. The frozen silence of the front shattered at dawn. After 16 months of blockade, the first Soviet artillery salvo thundered not at the city, but outward, toward the German lines. The men at the guns called it Operation Iskra, Spark. They had waited more than a year for this order. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes. The temperature was 20 below, the kind of cold that froze gun grease solid. Across the Neva River, flashes of light tore the horizon apart. For the first time since 1941, Leningrad was striking back. The plan was simple in words and impossible in practice. Two armies, the Leningrad and the Fokhov fronts, would attack from opposite sides of Lake Ladoga and meet near the shattered town of Schlisselburg. If they succeeded, they would open a narrow land corridor to the rest of the country, wide enough for a railway, narrow enough to die defending. The first assault units moved over the ice, crawling on hands and knees. German shells burst around them, sending waves through the frozen surface. The river moaned under the pressure. Men carried planks to bridge the cracks as they formed, slipping, bleeding, moving forward without looking back. Behind them, tanks waited for word that the ice could bear their weight. A radio operator in the 67th Army tapped out a single message: "Advance continues. Heavy resistance. We are still moving." He was found hours later, frozen at his post, headphones fused to his ears. The transmission never stopped. At Schlisselburg, what was left of the town had become a ruin of brick shells and splintered trees. German machine guns raked the open snowfields. Soviet infantry attacked in waves, sometimes 3, 4 times in the same hour. Each time the line fell, someone picked up the flag and went forward again. They fought for every cellar, every wall, every crater. By the third day, the ice was red. Smoke hung low, mixing with the fog. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and exhaust turned the air into something metallic. An engineer unit built bridges under fire, planks splitting from the cold. One sergeant was seen hammering with his bare hands after his gloves froze to the handle and tore away. Then, on January 18th, it happened. A small advance patrol from the Leningrad front stumbled into a group of soldiers from the Fokhov front. For a second, both sides froze, uniforms covered in frost, faces masked with disbelief. Then they began shouting, hugging, weeping. One of them fired a flare into the gray sky. It rose, sputtering, and exploded into white light. The radio message was sent immediately. Code word ISKRA confirmed. Leningrad connected. Inside the city, people heard it first as rumor, then as fact. The loudspeakers that had once warned of air raids now carried different words. The land corridor is open. Workers left their machines. Soldiers embraced in the snow. Nurses wept in hospital corridors. For the first time in 17 months, a convoy rolled into the city not over ice, but over earth. The trucks carried flour, salt, medical supplies. Nothing luxurious, but everything vital. People lined the streets as the vehicles arrived, thin arms waving. Some tried to touch the headlights, kissing the cold glass as if it were sacred. The engines rumbled through the ruined avenues, a sound more beautiful than any music the city had ever heard. A factory worker described it later. "We did not cheer. We simply breathed." But the battle was not over. The corridor was barely 10 kilometers wide and constantly under artillery fire. German positions still overlooked it from the surrounding hills. Every train that ran through had to race at full speed, lights off, hoping to outrun the shells. Still, for the first time since 1941, bread began arriving in real loaves, not rations of dust and sawdust. The rations were increased to 300 grams for workers, 200 for dependents. It was not abundance, but it was life. In German diaries, confusion replaced confidence. One officer wrote, "We believed the city would die before spring. Now the Russians have built a road through fire itself." For the people of Leningrad, it was not victory, not yet, but a beginning. The blockade had cracked. The city was still under siege, still bombed daily, still starved. But now there was a thread of land connecting them to the world beyond the barbed wire. And they would hold that thread no matter how many shells fell. As night fell on January 18th, the city's lights flickered weakly back to life. Power stations began humming again. A few factories blew their whistles in salute. not to signal a shift change, but to announce that the city was breathing. One engineer looked up at the faint glow over the rooftops and said, almost to himself, "If we can survive this, they will hear it in Berlin." He was right, but that sound was still a year away. January 27th, 1944. 872 days after the ring closed, Leningrad finally breathed free air. At 9:45 in the morning, the last German batteries on the southern front fell silent. Soviet troops had pushed them back more than 70 kilometers, far beyond the range of their guns. The siege, the longest in modern history, was over, but no one cheered at first. The sound of victory took time to reach the city's heart. People stood in the streets as if waiting for another shell. The silence felt heavier than the bombardment that had filled it for years. Then, slowly, from the loudspeakers that had once shouted "Air Raid," came a different voice. "Comrades, citizens of Leningrad, the blockade has been lifted." It was followed by a sound the city had forgotten: applause. Weak at first, then spreading like wine through the ruins. Men wept openly. Women clutched one another in disbelief. Soldiers stood with their rifles lowered, listening to the echo of a sentence they had thought they would never hear. That evening, for the first time since the war began, there was light. Flares rose above the Neva, then fireworks, real ones, exploded over the shattered rooftops. 24 artillery salvos, one for each of the city's districts. The flashes painted the sky red and gold. Some people flinched, instinctively ducking for cover. Then they realized it wasn't shellfire anymore. The city had survived, but survival was not the same as life. Every street carried ghosts. Over 1 million civilians were gone, starved, frozen, bombed, buried without graves. Entire families erased, buildings left standing like gravestones. Hospitals overflowed, not with wounded now, but with those too weak to walk even after peace returned. A nurse in the Kirov district wrote in her diary that night, "We are free, but there is no one left to tell." On Nevsky Prospect, people gathered around fires in the snow, passing pieces of bread between them. They did not celebrate, they shared in silence. The bread was fresh, soft, strange. One woman held her portion in her hands for a long time before eating. "It feels alive," she whispered. The next morning, workers returned to the same factories that had kept the city alive during the siege. Machines started again, clanking in the cold halls. The walls were black with soot, the floors still stained with oil and blood. But when the first whistle blew, a sound like breath returning filled the air. Children played on the frozen river, something no one had seen in 3 years. They skated on homemade blades, laughing in voices that echoed off the burned facades. One soldier, watching them, said quietly, "This is what we were fighting for." Across the river, the ruins of the Philharmonic Hall still stood. Inside, under broken chandeliers, a few surviving musicians gathered again. They tuned their instruments with shaking hands and began to play. It wasn't Shostakovich this time, just a simple Russian folk song, soft and slow. But it was enough. The melody drifted through the cracks, out into the cold air, over the graves and the rubble. The world listened again. The same foreign newspapers that once printed "Leningrad doomed" now carried headlines calling it "the city that would not die." Photographs showed faces thin and hollow but unbroken. The impossible had happened. A city had survived hunger, fire, and ice, and still managed to sound like humanity. In Berlin, officers read the reports with disbelief. One of them, years later, wrote, "We thought they would starve in a month. They starved, but they did not die. They outlived us." For the people who remained, every step after liberation was a reckoning. They walked through streets where their neighbors had fallen. They rebuilt walls using bricks that still bore the heat of explosions. They planted flowers over mass graves without markers. The snow that winter was gray, and yet, when spring came, grass pushed through it all the same. In April, the Philharmonic performed the Seventh Symphony once more. The audience stood for a full minute before the first note. Many were in uniform, others in bandages. No one spoke during the performance. When it ended, there was no cheering, only quiet tears and the faint sound of the city breathing again. Radio Leningrad broadcast a single sentence that night. "This is Leningrad. We are alive." Years later, historians would calculate numbers, calories, temperatures, tonnage, casualties, and call it victory. But those who had lived it never used that word. For them, it was something else, something harder and holier. It was endurance, the strength to stand when standing was no longer humanly possible. Leningrad did not simply survive a siege. It redefined what survival meant. It proved that what could become a weapon sharper than steel, and that even when the body is gone, defiance can still breathe. And so, when people said afterward that the city had been saved, those who knew better only shook their heads. No, Leningrad saved itself.